Legendary people. I'm told they're getting some pushback from colleagues at this appellation, but we truly do have very distinguished public historians here and distinguished innovators in the digital humanities and in an inclusive notion of public history. So we are very pleased to have our local man is Michael Frisch, who is a preeminent US and oral public historian. He is Emeritus Professor and Senior Research Scholar at the University of Buffalo, and he's perhaps best known for the concept laid out in his 1990 book, A Shared Authority. He is today the principal of a consulting firm, Randforce Associates, which came out of, I guess, U of Buffalo's technology incubator. And this creates, as I understand it, oral history software for clients in various sectors, in business, in nonprofit, in the public sector. And he also runs a private website on Depression-era music. Last night from Mumbai, Palagummi Sainath very kindly came to us at a very busy time in his life. He is, I think we can say, one of India's preeminent journalists, and he is especially known for having brought critical news of rural conditions to the national attention during his time at the Hindi newspaper in Delhi. He resigned from this position in 2014 to concentrate full-time on his position as founder editor of the People's Archive of Rural India. And this is a volunteer-based documentation project that takes local conditions, traditional knowledge, cultural expressions, and local activism in a holistic way, all as part of this same rural world of activity. The two of them, I think, will just tell us very briefly, perhaps give us a very brief little show and tell about what they do, and then we will open up the conversation between them and have input from you as the moment presents itself. So we will begin with Mike Frisch, whose PowerPoint I will open up again. And then move on.
Well, thank you very much. I am being teased a lot, but I figure folklorists are the ones who know about legends and things like that. That's what you do. So if somebody calls you, or both of us, legendary, it carries folkloric authority. And so we humbly accept it, at least with tongue-in-cheek a little bit. So very, very briefly, as a prelude to the conversation that will take most of the time. So I'm the one who comes out of the academic setting. I was a straight historian, writing on the 19th century, actually urban development, not rural. And gradually, through my association initially with American Studies as a movement and as an insurgent department at Buffalo, I began to get interested in oral history. And what appealed to me in oral history was the notion that you're hearing voices from lots of directions. And in this collection of essays called A Shared Authority, I suppose the central idea was that authority, meaning authorship, is not something that we have and then we then presume to share with someone else. It's something that's inherent in the nature of an interview, of the nature of the oral history relationship, that there is interpretation, there is meaning making, there is storification on all sides, and what we're called on to do is actually pay attention to that and respect it and listen to it and end up with a dialogue between whatever it is that scholars might bring and whatever it is that people bring from the world that they are speaking from. That gradually led me almost accidentally to what became a kind of increasingly digital practice. The fundamental reality of oral history is that everybody says it's really cool and wonderful to do all these great interviews and to hear people talk, and then nobody listens to what they have to say. At best, things get transcribed. The underutilization of oral histories everywhere is scandalous in the extreme because they're so hard to work with. So one thing after another led me into a fascination, without any technical background myself, with new digital tools for essentially indexing audio and video as the primary source of oral history, rather than turning it into transcripts, although those remain important and are still in wide use. But there are, in fact, lots of ways of marking up material so that in a 50-hour collection you can say, I want to hear stories about mothers and daughters, and you're brought to 7 places within the body of material where that's being talked about. So we began, this is not done automatically, it's done through essentially like a word processor helps you type. It's better than typing. There are digital tools that allow you to mark up material, associate metadata with time codes, and be able to literally move around within hundreds of hours of audio and video materials and find things that can then be extracted for use. So more and more, it seemed to me, I suppose the energizing idea in this became that I was also doing a lot of work with documentary films, which has long been an interest of mine. And it became clear that documentary is really wonderful, but in a way, it's just a path through the source material. It's somebody's story. 54 minutes out of 25 hours of outtakes, or whatever the ratio usually is. And so the question became, what are all the other stories that are in that are on the cutting room floor, or they're not selected? So that really helped us think of what we were doing in this content mapping of oral history as essentially sharing the authority of finding things, much less interpreting them, and putting this in a form that anybody could enter 50 hours of materials, define what they were looking for, and have tools with which it could be identified and found. And that led to the final bit in this very compressed trajectory, that led me to, it was initially a spin-off of the software that we were using for digital indexing of long interviews, and we began to think about starting at the other end. If the problem with long interviews is that you have to find something within it, at the other end is what I'm coming to think of as short-form oral history. What if you imagined a shorter form that could be then built out into a larger portrait? And I'll get to this in just a second in the quick run-through of my little bits of slides. I'll do more of this in the roundtable that Robert's organized on tomorrow morning. Essentially, began working with photo elicitation and an app that we developed that essentially allows you to add a story to a photograph and put the two together. Sainath has some incredible examples of this on his website. So in ours, it's done on a mobile phone. They can then be gathered in a web place and used in lots of ways. So let me quickly take you through all of this. The first thing I'd like you to do is picture, just get something in your mind, especially those of you who are not oral historians, what an oral history collection looks like. Kind of imagine its shape and its form. Now imagine an oral history archive with a lot of these in it. Got a picture there? Okay. Now picture a collection and archive, let's say, holding up to 5,000 interviews. Imposing. Now imagine that all the interviews are less than a minute long. And that seems counterintuitive in the extreme. What kind of interview could have meaning if it were a minute long, much less thousands and thousands of them? And it occurred to us, even before I was asked to give a presentation in Ravenna, Italy, whose relevance will be clear in a second, that for thousands and thousands of years, one of our major way of telling stories in the visual arts is something like this, which is a mosaic made up of tiny, tiny little tiles. This is another one. These are 4th century from Ravenna, where this conference was last year, is the World Center for Byzantine Mosaics in a series of 4th century cathedrals that are astounding, really. One more. So these are all very complex pictures, all made up of a tiny tile. So what if we imagined a mosaic oral history? Mosaics made up of a tiny little bit of audio, in our case, audio, photographic, multimedia content. that then is a modular element that can be arranged to tell larger patterns. So very quickly, I have materials on this if anybody wants it, since I'm now working in a private sector. I don't have any embarrassment about pushing our stuff. So this is Picstree. It's a free app available in the App Store. Our first version has only been on iOS for reasons of not having any money to develop Android. And basically, you have a mobile phone, you take a picture, you call up a picture. We've had people in people's homes taking, they're really good cameras, taking a picture of whatever is on their mantelpiece. Then you get it on the phone, you call it up, push a button, tell a story, and upload it to these web portals, which begin to have a Mosaic feel on the bottom. This is the card we had made up for Ravenna. Every tile tells a story. All the stories make a big picture. And we put a couple of little glimpses of the Ravenna mosaics above. This one actually is Christine Zinni's Food and Culture of the Mediterranean Study Abroad, a tour from 2016, I think, where the students documented their field work, either got audio capture on site or got back and then either at home or in the hotel actually talked about what they'd seen and what they learned from it and what it meant to them. I've done another project. Some of you know the book I did with Buffalo's, well, really the world's great documentary photographer, Milton Rogovan, who did a lot of his work here in Buffalo and just died a few years ago at 101. And I did a book called Portraits in Steel, which was oral histories, long oral histories of steel workers who had worked in our industry and who all then lost their jobs because every factory that he shot in closed in the 1970s and 1980s. So I went around at his request and we did life history interviews that was published by Cornell Press. But most recently, in the last couple of years, thinking of this photo-audio interaction, which I've been getting more and more intrigued with, we used our indexing software to pull out the audio clips that originally had been the basis of text in an exhibition. And I've put together, you could write down that website, but it's not likely you'll get it. So if you just send me an email, mfrisch@buffalo.edu, this is a free download. It's about a 20-minute video of 4 of the people, and it seems such a simple idea, but it's a mark of how limited we've been in oral history and in its archival basis, and even in the arts, that according to the museum curator in Louisville who presented this as an exhibit, he could not think of any example, maybe a few scattered ones, where you'd been able to look in the long history of documentary photography, particularly of workers and people sort of at the bottom of society, to look at their portraits and actually hear the voices, much less know the names of the people who are in it. So this is an audio photographic loop, which I think you might enjoy. Send me an email and I'll shoot you back this quick link from there. And I don't have the coming attraction. We are about to perfect, we hope, and at least launch, even if not quite perfect, a web app version of the Picstree app, which will also be free. And what this means is it'll be up in the cloud all the time. You'd be able to post photos there and get people wherever they are, if they have a Wi-Fi connection, to document them on any device, tell stories about them. The example we have is based on the upcoming 50th anniversary of Woodstock next year. And literally, should they choose, they could put their entire photo archive online. People could browse that. If they see something that sparks a memory, they push the button and record a story. We're hoping to do something similar with the 2020 centennial of the 19th Amendment, giving women the rights to vote, where they could gather 1 million stories through this kind of social media. So this is kind of the broad trajectory that has led me into digital practice, and I think into what I think is a strikingly obvious but really counterintuitive new approach to oral history, what I'm calling mosaic or short-form oral history, as something we need to, and we can, add to the toolbox. Something that I'll go into in more detail tomorrow has particular appeal in folklore, where you're dealing with material culture and place and things that are embodied in both objects and environments, and everybody likes telling stories about what they can see. So to think of this as a mode for story gathering and story sharing seems to make a lot of sense. So I have material here. Anybody afterwards, come up and get it.
Apparently the mosaics of the convention center have very porous tiles. I apologize for this terrible noise. It turns out that there are visiting artists behind us in the book room. I'm wondering, shall we pull our chairs up next to the podium so that you're farther away from the noise? Would that help? Or are we just gonna?
Speak into the microphone more.
It would, thank you, Robert. Okay, we will just go forward. Would you like to then?
Actually, at lunch, both Mike and I were agreeing on the incredible importance of audio accompaniment to text and visual presentation, and here we have it. So we shouldn't be complaining, right? I mean, since I'm going to make a detailed presentation on the People's Archive tomorrow, I won't get too much into the site's presentation just now, but the idea of why digital and why are we doing this thing at all. I think I'm coming at it from the perspective of a worldwide retreat of the rural. The rural is in collapse everywhere. The countryside is in collapse. Okay? And well, for 150 years, mostly around the world, we've lived on a kind of mythology of the inevitability of the urban, that this is the only way it can be. People move out of villages, move out of agriculture and move to the city, and a very, very fraying, decrepit industrial model, but it's there. So that's one thing. Second is, when journalism itself has seriously failed us. If you look at the last 25, 30 years, what most people call the mainstream media, and what I call the corporate media, because it excludes the mainstream. You don't give them the label of mainstream, right? And what's happened is that you have simply nothing about the everyday lives of everyday people. That doesn't exist. And I think both Mike Frisch and I understand the difficulty of the area we are in, because if we're talking about corporate monopolies, it should be said up front that the digital monopolies are the greatest monopolies in history. Not only in terms of scope, scale, but also for the simple fact that they do one thing that no monopolies in history have ever been able to do. They own your personal data and traffic in it. Okay? I call them human data traffickers. But so they own your data, they sell it, they make money. You're watching what's happening with Facebook and all the stuff that's coming out. So is there a digital space for everyday people, for their histories, for their cultures, for their songs, their music, their stories? Yep. And how do you keep that a public archive or a people's archive? How do we make that? Actually, there's a very important reason why we use the word people's archive. Archives historically have been hated by people. If you go back to medieval England, you will find that archivists and surveyors, documentarists used to be beaten up by the peasantry when they came to measure land. Because somewhere that peasant understood that somebody coming from somewhere to record and document my land is the first step towards somebody else acquiring my land. They understood that. Secondly, archives have been sites of censorship. Now, India 2018, though the 35-year classification on confidential documents died many years ago, I cannot access a single important file or document on India, on the India-China War of 1962. The classification period is over, but you can't access it. So they keep extending the confidentiality of it. So in fact, the archive is used by state and officialdom as a way of keeping people away from knowledge, or keeping knowledge away from people. And libraries, you know, have their own history from when they were being burnt down from Alexandria to Nalanda, where, well, the idea of having a people's archive is stories told from below, the everyday lives of everyday people, positioned in a digital space where states and governments can't dismantle them. That's one very important part of our understanding. Even suppose tomorrow the government was to shut down our site, we have a mirror site ready. Maybe we lose 5-10% the last day or last 2-3 days of thing, but there's a site, it'll go up. Now what does the bringing of everyday people to the digital space actually mean? The media are in many ways the most elitist and exclusionist institutions of democracy. You just only have to look at in India for instance, you just have to look at who the opinion makers are. It's 12 to 15 guys from the same caste group, from the same elite Brahmanical group. Okay, so you have an extraordinary concentration of power and media power in caste terms, in class terms, in financial terms. And the extent of corporate control of media today, India's richest man is also India's biggest media owner, Mr. Mukesh Ambani, who makes Forbes every year, gets his own special space in Forbes list of billionaires. Like for instance, in the last 12 months, he earned $16.9 billion additionally to the wealth he already had. That's $2 million an hour. Must have worked very hard, right? So you have, this person owns your media. The last 25-30 years of corporate control of media have reduced journalism to a revenue stream. It's entirely become a revenue stream. I think I'm treading into a later question, but this is the thing. Journalism, history is not meant to be a revenue stream. Yeah, people's histories, they're right. So part of the idea is also to take journalism out of the hands of corporations and back to the hands of communities. It becomes very complex in a country like India, which has 780 living languages. We publish in 12, by the way. Okay, and those 12 have 900 million or about 1 billion speakers, but it's a very extremely difficult job. Now, 2 points, and I'll hand back the floor to you. It's not as if there is something static that you're trying to record, whether it's the work he's doing or it's the work I'm doing. We're trying to record lots of things that will not exist 20 years, maybe 10 years from now, a lot of them will not exist. Whole genres of music that are dying. We, for instance, have recorded 110,000 songs composed by poor women in the villages while working at the grind mill, the chakki, we call it, the grind mill. You'll see it in the museums, but in Indian villages, women still grind the flour while sitting on the floor using the grind mill. It's called the Grind Mill Songs Collection. We've published about 270. We have only 107,000 more to, record it. We've got the transcripts. We've written down every single song that was done in the 80s and 90s. Now we are going back to the villages to record them. So we have something like what happened with all of you for your World War II veterans or those Americans who fought in Spain. A generation is dying. For us, our freedom fighters, those who fought the British for the liberation of India and Indian independence, they're all 95 plus. The youngest is 91, 92. In 5 years, there will likely be no one left. Okay? No one will be left. We need to record them. We need to have their stories, their films, as told by themselves. The idea of sharing again, so in our platform and in our perspective, is that even in a photograph, our guidelines, every photograph, we don't think it's just consent, that if you get the person's consent, the job is done. Consent is a starting point. We are also talking about collaboration, creation, crediting, co-authoring. This is it. Like, for instance, also, now when we are trying to cover the forests and forest dwellers, take one of the great forests in India, it's called Bandipur in Karnataka. Now, the typical thing about covering a forest like this is that you get somebody from National Geographic to do it, who will come, take the most wonderful, technically the most brilliant images, and a photo essay that tells you nothing about the forest, the people, the histories, the cultures, because they're very unlikely to be even conversing with people in any serious manner. What we do is to give minimal training to forest dwellers and let them do the photo essays for us. So they do the photo essays and we carry that. Yeah, and I'll later maybe show you. So this is the thing. We are trying to capture a rapidly transforming countryside. 225 languages died in the last 50 years. They've gone extinct. We need to record them. So we have an endangered languages program. All these things bring us to the digital. We could never, ever do it in print or television. The question of even raising a fraction of the resources for that, we're finding it difficult enough for this. That would be impossible. The digital space offers us that, and the rest is learning about how little we know.
Okay, is this mic functioning? Yeah. All right, I hope we have 3 functioning mics. From this point, I thought we would go to a few questions I have. We will let them take over as they wish, and then open it up to all of you. I wanted, first of all, to follow along, since Sainath has told us about this collaborative methodology, which is similar to some things that a number of us are experimenting with. I'm interested in what happens to shared authority once it has gone digital, because I think there are certain effects from looking at digital media. In a sense, the individuals are much more foregrounded. Their faces are there, and you have another amazing project that involves showing people's faces. But the faces are there, the voices are there, you know, there's an appearance of people telling their own story. At the same time, there is, you know, a logistics of production that involves a great deal, not only the background of the corporate platforms, but also these intermediate decisions about framing, about what's going to be highlighted, about the sort of choreography of these voices. And so I'm wondering about how the decision-making process changes when there is this sort of heavy secondary production work, I guess you might say. And perhaps maybe Sainath, if you would like to start, and then maybe Mike, you could tell us a bit about how you think this notion of shared authority is evolving in digital contexts.
Could you start? I'd like to hear that.
Okay.
Well, I think as I began working a lot with digital stuff, I of course thought I was doing something completely different than what I'd been writing about for 20 years. And it's always a great discovery that you only have so many good ideas and they keep coming up in different forms. So it really remained very relevant, and it became clear that a lot of what was driving our work was trying to put into people's hands the tools with which they could participate in this process of figuring out what was important to them and what to do with it. So a lot of many of our indexing projects, we essentially, which we're often working with community organizations and other kind of generators of knowledge at often the community or the small institution level, it was an interesting collaboration there because we said, well, we know a little bit about metadata, and we know a little bit about coding frames, and we know a little bit about this, but you know what you're looking for, or you know what's going on in your material. And so it became a kind of dialogic process of helping to translate into effective terms that ultimately they could take over the workup of the materials that would nevertheless involve their own sort of decisions about what stories were important and what they wanted to do with them. But I must say that that is probably a little romantic, and in practice, working in the digital realm remains intimidating for all of us, myself included. It's easy to feel displaced at every level, and certainly more at the community level. And in a way, that's kind of driven more and more the interest that I've had in these short forms, because if it's people telling quick stories in a mode that's natural to them about a photograph, and if they do that on a level, then in some ways they've unfolded in that kind of storytelling mode a lot of what's important to them. And then it's really quite possible, we're finding, to say, well, what's the bigger story that these begin to tell? And they can then be involved in arranging these and selecting them and figuring out which ones are the most important. When we work with Christine and her students, the idea was always make these things in the field, but then you can curate them yourselves. You come back and say, well, of these 8 comments that I've had, which are the ones that really, or the 8 field notes that we've gotten at the Olive Press, which are the ones that seem to tell us the most? So there's nothing, I think, about that process that's out of reach, and people seem to enjoy being part of that. So I'm thinking more and more that what we're looking for is digital tools that are themselves in a primary way shareable, that don't involve a lot of complicated interaction. And at least the initial work we're doing on larger projects that are using these small short form Mosaic bits, that's proving relatively easy for people to understand, to work with, to begin to play with, and not get all caught up in the larger dilemmas of managing large collections. So I see it as consistent with opening up a sort of shareable authority in terms of really working up the stories that the community itself is involved in generating.
I think that is very important. In fact, by the way, the culture section of the People's Archive of Rural India is called Mosaic. That's the title of our culture section. In terms of the sharing, I think part of our challenge is demystification of the digital. One is democratization of the digital, which is a very important thing to do. Like democratizing or decolonizing the internet itself. Democratization of the digital is a very important thing to do. And the second part of that as well, demystifying it. Making it, you don't have, everything you do need not be mediated by hordes of experts. People can do it. They can set it up. I'm very pleased to tell you that this morning, an initiative sparked by People's Archive went online in the People's Archive of Rural Nova Scotia.
Wow.
Yeah, they've said it's gone up today. I mean, I got the mail today. I think it went up yesterday. The people's pounds. Our belief is that every community should have one. In my narrow, selfish interest, that every rural community should have one, because their histories and their songs, their cultures are being lost, are being taken over, appropriated, and gone. And the sharing part of it is how okay, the legal part, let me say very frankly that we work under Creative Commons 4.2, which is non-derivative, non-commercial, which means that anyone is free to download our material. Anyone is free to download our material and use it. We encourage students, particularly teachers and students, to download and use our material, provided it has the appropriate, full, correct attribution, yeah, to the original authors, to the People's Archive, etc. We do not charge a fee for that. We cannot, because we have registered ourselves as a non-profit, something that we often have occasion to regret. But yeah, but that's how it is. The second part of it is non-derivative. I can't take some work of yours, 80% of your work, add 3 lines to it, put it in somewhere else as my work. So these are the two things that we practice. We work under the Creative Commons 4.2 version of version 4, 4.2. I don't remember. So that's one. Second is how do you share in a broader sense? As I said, if you look at our journalism and our writing, our authorship, it's from an extremely narrow strata of society. We are talking about 0.00 something % of society. Okay? All the writing, everything gets done by them. The telling of history, stories, everything gets done by them. So one of the things we've done is, like say, we divide the country into 95 to 100 regions. And we are trying to see that every single region is represented there, which actually 90% of regions are heavily underrepresented in what you call mainstream or corporate media, right? So, but we do this, we ensure that there is a fellow, a People's Archive fellow, resident between 3 months and 1 year over there. But that's not the only important way of spreading it or distributing it. Who are the fellows? Now, if we have a fellowship body of 100 fellows, so far we have 16, 15. When we hit that 100 mark and cover every region, we are absolutely clear that the fellowship's body must reflect the social demographic of India. Meaning, there have got to be at least 8 indigenous people who are fellows in the fellowship's body. They've got to be at least 16 fellows who are Dalits, the so-called untouchables, representing their percentage in the population. They've got to be at least 50 women fellows. They've got to be at least 15 from religious cultural minorities. So reflecting the Indian, we think then that way an actual reverse sharing also takes place, as the sources from where we draw are incredibly broader than what many of us spent 30 years in journalism doing. So those are some of the ways we go.
Just one quick comment to sort of respond to the same question with a slightly different thing, and we talked about this a lot at lunch, that a lot of this work with short forms has really impressed upon me the remarkable power of still photographs and audio compared to video and the standard ways that documentaries are usually conveyed. Because what really happens is that if you imagine as I do anyway, imagine video is essentially a linear experience. Things are moving past you and you follow along. The experience of listening to sound and looking at a picture that's not moving is essentially spatial. You enter that space, and what happens in that space is unscripted. So you're looking at the picture, you can think whatever you want. You can have your own independent things. Roland Barthes has written a great deal about this in his famous work, which is really about how hard it is to look at pictures, and how much, once you give yourself the time to do it, you enter into that dialogue with the image, regardless of what the photographer was intending, and you notice things, what he calls the punctum, the prick, that pricks your imagination, and you then are in dialogue. Well, you add the audio, and it becomes even more complex. We're finding, as people experience these modes, including the Rogovan example that I had and others, that and the Picstree things, when people work with that, that they seem to have no problem listening to a story, processing it fully, having completely independent responses to the picture, and then, in effect, bringing all of that into a kind of trialogue, if you imagine that the audience is then part of it. So I think for a lot of the work, certainly in folklore, the notion of creating modes that allow people, both as audience and as participants in communities, to invest images with their own unscripted meaning, and then to have those available for discussion, is really, in a funny way, we don't know that much about what happens in that space. I think we need a lot more modes like the one we're working with. Just open it up. There are lots of others. We were talking at lunch about work that I've done. I do music on the side. We did a whole program of Depression-era music against a backdrop of FSA photographs. And more than once, actually quite regularly, people would come up and say, with an element of real surprise, gee, as long as you were singing the song, I kept looking at that picture and seeing all sorts of things in it. And as long as I was looking at that picture, I'm remembering verses that were in that song. So it was like, instead of the zero-sum notion of attention that I think we all intuitively have, people have so much attention and they will parse it out, it's actually exponential, or at least additive. 2 + 2 = at least 8. That there's something in that space, if you can free people to keep looking at something which they're not comfortable. Most of us will not look at a photograph. I've seen, I'm sure you have, museum studies of major documentary photography exhibits. 1.8 seconds is about what most of the stopwatches show people give to the photo, and even that, they're moving. Oh, nice picture. Oh, that nice picture. Oh, that really interesting. And that's it. So anything that arrests attention creates this kind of liberating sense of engagement, unscripted. I think it becomes more than dialogic. It becomes actually multifaceted. And I think those things are opening us up to a lot of ways. Again, I love documentary and have been involved in a lot of them, but it's in its own way a very authoritarian mode. Literally, there's an author of the documentary. And what we're watching, we are receiving, whether it's Ken Burns or, what's his name? I'm forgetting, the one who made the Tittycut. What?
Errol Morris?
Well, Errol Morris and yeah, well, I'm thinking the Tittycut Follies and all of that. What's his name?
Yes,
Anyway, it doesn't matter. It's still, you're getting a vision. You can then step back and talk about it, but you've got to receive it whole first, and then you walk around. Whereas in some of these other modes, I think they're more open. And some of the things I've seen, the stories I've seen on Sainath's site, not just the ones with photographs, but the narratives themselves, have exactly that quality of presenting something and letting you, in some ways, walk around it, walk behind it. One final example, because it's much on my mind. I was at a meeting just last week, and there was somebody who, we ended up having a great conversation afterwards, although I was a little, she billed herself as, I am a virtual reality evangelist. I want to tell you how excited I am about virtual reality. And then she got people up there actually to put on these goggles that they wear, and we watched them immersed in a reality that, of course, we couldn't see. It seemed really weird, actually. But in fact, a lot of what they were saying is in virtual reality, you're not just a prisoner of a two-dimensional image. You walk around it, you can choose how you want to look at it, and I understand that's all really powerful. But we're finding a lot of that happens when you have a minute to spend with a photograph, you do that in your imagination. You don't need the virtual reality to look behind it or to develop your own perspective or to think about its relevance in your life or where something in that image or in the bit of audio sparks something that is an association that you can then take charge of and run with. So I think there's a lot going on in this kind of multimedia, and certainly in terms of public history and its relation to folklore, we're so grounded in really a very unnecessarily passé notion of archival. You need to start with long archival documents because that's what we're all based on. And the more we take advantage of the capacity to create experiences in multimedia forms that are much more engageable, I think the potential, I really share Sainath's view. We all know the rap about corporate media and even in social media and all of that. We also know that if we can find comfortable ways for people to engage this, that it has some liberating and shareable potential too. So that's the edge we're all walking in a lot of our practice.
Yeah. Emily, do you want to go ahead? Well, the two of you are raising, I think, two halves of an issue that I then wanted to ask about in talking, Mike, about reception and imagination, and in sort of creating the spurs to that imagination on the part of the recipient. It raises a sort of mythical function of media, let's say, in the making of the nation state. So, you know, Benedict Anderson's idea of imagined community, that once you have newspapers, people can begin to look horizontally across at this sort of shared space, and they can begin to imagine themselves as existing in common time and in a common predicament with other people in this space. And Sainath, you've talked about the representational part of that you actually have to have the representation among the producers for that imagination to be anything more than a pure invention. But it raises the question then, when you have this participatory work, in a sense, your participants are also your audience because they are coming out of communities, they are doing things that they will, of course, be circulating among themselves and their networks and so on. But there is also a larger public that's implied here, both in terms of, I think, who you want to reach and who, because of the internet, you'll reach whether you want to or not. And I wonder what thoughts the two of you have about the public in public humanities and what you want to see happen there and how you can help that to happen.
Okay. Who are the public? Oh. We approach it in maybe 2-3 different ways. One, we see that there is a huge gap pertaining to not just the rural but to poor people in general in what is incorrectly termed mainstream media. For instance, the average Indian national daily gives 0.67% of its front page to rural India, where 69% of its population lives. 69% of the population, 0.67% of the front page. And then if you move inside, into the inside pages, the data is from an organization, the oldest media studies organization in India called Center for Media Studies, Delhi. And you go to the inside pages, all the social sector areas, health, education, you name it, environment, all the social sector areas together do not get the space that crime and entertainment get. Okay? I mean, that's the equation. In a country, in a society that desperately needs those things to be covered, right? So we are actually trying the public in a larger sense as well. That's one. The second, we are trying to reach children in schools, colleges, and universities, youngsters in schools, colleges, and universities. There's again a very specific reason crying out to be why this cries out to be done. Every year, millions and millions of children enter school in India. Less than half of them make it up to high school, and a fraction of them make it to college and university. One, they can't afford, in an increasingly privatized educational environment, they can't afford the tuition fee, let alone the textbooks required, the teaching material required, the learning material required. So the idea of our search for audiences, we are getting into schools and colleges, trying to work with children, and the idea is that we are the digital textbook of the future, completely free of charge. Like, for instance, a college student doing an undergrad in sociology, having to write their term paper or essay or final or dissertation on female agricultural labor, has the option of reading somebody's 40-year out-of-date PhD thesis converted into a even more boring textbook, or put on a video on Pari and watch those female agricultural laborers talk to you directly. They're telling you their stories, not through an outdated 40-year-old textbook, but you're actually having that lady show you her work, show you her home, take you through how she cuts. And we have one who is very proudly telling us, I am much more skilled than a harvester combine. It wastes this much. It cuts at this height. We cut at a different height, according to the need for the stock for fodder. Okay? So it's so much more engaging for the student to be actually listening to the people whom they are then to write dissertations about or answer papers about. So that's, we are looking into the students of that. We are also creating material for teachers. So we've got people who will then use Pari in the classroom. It's happening with several universities. We have collaborations with them. Unfortunately, we don't at this point earn anything from it and can't, but it's happening with more and more universities asking us for teaching material. So far, though, it's largely happening at the level of individual faculties. In the case of 5-6 universities, the university itself has come to us for some kind of an agreement. So you're looking for audiences in the so-called mainstream media audiences. We're looking at them in terms in the younger generation, schools and colleges and people like that. And we're also looking at them in languages where they are neglected, where they don't have access to a lot of material about the country that they need to have. So they may not read it in the Mizo language, the Lushai language. They may not read much in their own language. We try creating that for them. So these are the left out people, so to speak, whom we try making our audiences. However, we also have a very large audience of journalists and media people, because there are so many people who really feel their audiences deserve better. And incidentally, many of them working at senior positions in corporate media, moonlight for us on the side, free of charge, because the stuff they like doing will never fly on their channels and in their newspapers. Yeah.
Well, one of the privileges of working as a consultant, as we're doing now, is you work mostly with clients. So the question of the larger public rarely comes up there. Most of them have particular audiences. It might be a community. It might be a scholarly user of an archive. It could be anybody connected to that collection. And so, as I mentioned before, our job is to help them get control of the material so that they can do with their communities exciting work with that. But more and more, as I work with these short form modes, I'm struck with the unique power that they have for providing a basis for public engagement. When I did my book with Milton Rogovin that I referred to on Buffalo Steelworkers, the idea was to both have them document his photographs. People love talking about photographs and their family and the work that they were doing, even though one publisher among the 10 rejection slips we had was a publisher who said, they're not working in steel anymore. Who cares about the detail of the work that they did? This is what their whole life had been based on. So we were glad they didn't decide to publish the book. But in any event, that threw me off track. All right, so what I tried to do in the interviews was to move from a description of their home life and their work life, which is what his photographs were about, to the process of living through the layoffs, and then to their understanding of what was going on both in Buffalo and by extension in the larger society in this major change, not very helpfully, but usually called deindustrialization. And it was really hard. I mean, by and large, I worked really hard at it. There are a lot of ways within an interview, if you have, if you're an attentive interviewer, you can find your way to create an exchange around that. Usually it required people having to be walked around. First thing, at the larger level, the public level, they would generally start by repeating whatever they'd heard on television the night before, because essentially they didn't have a grounded context that they were confident about. So they said, oh, he's asking about big ideas, so they just reached back and pulled, well, some people say, and reported that. Once we got into it, you could end up, essentially they would get in touch with what they really thought, and they often had lots of things to say. My favorite quick example was when in an embarrassing moment, I enjoyed playing for my students. I, in effect, patronized this guy, big, kind of beefy Buffalo working class guy, pictured in front of his boat in the picture at home. So I used a sports analogy, talking about deindustrialization. I said, so what do you think? Is this like, like a growing, it's just like a natural development? You could be playing hockey in your 20s, but you don't expect to be playing hockey in your 50s? Or is there something really wrong with what's going on? And he looked up at me and he said, oh, I don't agree with that at all. You see, being a steel industry and being a hockey player are really different. And then it was like, take 1, 2, 3, and then he just slapped his leg, like, I got you, professor, with your fancy, look down your nose, give me a sports metaphor thing. And then he proceeded to have a pretty interesting discussion about what he thought was going on with the economy and Reagan and Bush and what have you. So I think there are ways to do this, but it's very, very tricky. And I'm struck, even when I think of classic oral histories, that if one started with short forms and you have people talking about photographs a lot, let's say they do 20 or 30, in effect, that's a narrative mode we know that people are more comfortable with rather than responding to somebody's smart-ass question from on high. They're very comfortable with that. There are lots of ideas in that. And then I can imagine we have somebody doing this now. You could then, on that basis, talk about shared authority, look at those 20 stories about a family and have a real discussion where you say, well, it seems to me, I keep hearing this story about luck or, how, whatever it might be, some theme. And then the person has a base. They've already storied that in a way. And I think we know that they would be more than comfortable being able to recognize that as a larger umbrella idea and run with it. So I think the potential of broadening our modes of, in this case, documenting field work, and then creating a basis for a different type of discussion, which would, in effect, bridge the gap between the highly particular rendition of a photo comment and a more abstractable thematic idea that one expects in public discourse, and allow more participation in that dialogue, I think.
Great. So let's go to comments now. Can I ask everybody, please stand up and really project, and then I'm going to repeat your questions because we're recording. So I first have Emily and then Christine.
No, the app the way the app is anybody can use it. It doesn't have to be an interviewer. They're telling a story about the photograph, or they're responding.
But
And
they're given a 90-minute,
No,
90-second
they
framework
could go on.
to
I
do it.
mean, we usually advise people that since you're going to be looking at the photograph, this is not the best way to record a 15-minute narrative. So most people sort of naturally go with something 45 seconds to a minute and a half, sometimes 2 minutes, whatever they have to say. Depends a little bit on the photograph. I mean, if there are photographs that have 5 people in it and they want to discuss the members of their family, it might go longer. But essentially, it's self-determined in that way. Oh, yes. Well, very, very quickly, I mean, this is a tool, and people are going to use it in all sorts of ways. The basic part of the tool is that this is intended for standalone, short-form responses. That's not a long interview, but it's not nothing. And what we're finding is it's not people look at a picture. I'll give you one quick example. I don't have it here to play. This is a good one for folklorists. Picture of a weathered stair on an old house in Buffalo. And the woman says something like this. She said, "This is the house my great-grandfather built on Hamburg Street in South Buffalo. I visited it last summer. And this stair is probably the only authentic thing left in the house that you can still see. And I walked up that stair, and in the front room, there was a young girl making drawings. And I remembered I had been a young girl in that room making drawings. And I thought, this is absolutely remarkable, and that's what I experienced the day I revisited my great-grandfather's house in the summer of 2016. Boom. That's it. It's like a little poem. And, I mean, in a way, the thing I quip all the time, quoting a friend of mine, we were talking about this, and he's came out of literature, no oral history background, but he said, so what you're saying is that oral history, if it were literature, oral history has been based on the idea that the only acceptable form is the novel. But we have poems that are, 14 lines long. Or he said there are a lot of literary forms that have meaning. So I think what we've opened up is what happens in a minute and a half narration that might if you look at that one that I just described, it's remarkable. You know, the picture of the stair keeps changing in your mind as she unfolds the story. A friend who saw that observed, said, I don't know, it's not clear whether she actually saw a little girl there or whether she's seeing herself as that little, it doesn't matter. It's, she puts herself in motion, you watch her walking up the stairs, she's off into some time, space, memory, and you end up with a dense nugget of high affect stuff that's not what it would be if it were snipped out of a long interview, but it's not nothing. So my simple sense watching people work with it is it's in effect a new medium, and we don't know that much about what happens in that space. I think I'd like to see a lot more examples, and then we'll be able to get a sense of how people work with it. Two quick things on sharing this, which some partners are interested in, others are not. We don't have it yet in our software, but you can upload to YouTube if you have an MP4, which is one of our export forms, and you get closed captioning, which is pretty good and easily corrected. If it's only 125 words, it's not hard to correct that. If it were a long interview, it's a lot of work. And I think the same is true for translation, that the potential in these modes of bringing in all kinds of translation endings, because you're dealing with very short responses, and you could then render it in a number of languages in text underneath and be solving both the audio limitations and the translation accessibility at the same time.
Yeah, just very quickly, you know, I think we should look at length or duration in light of content and context. Now, if the 1.5 minute video is part of an archive where there are hundreds of similar videos, that's a hell of a lot of footage. Okay, that's huge. And it is actually a hugely learning platform at that point. But the other thing is that we allow people to make, you know, the videos from 20, 30 seconds to 30 minutes. But we find that the shorter videos, the shorter films, which say, even a documentary we may call it, which is at about 4 minutes, 5 minutes, embedded in a text article of maybe 1,000, 1,200 words, plus audio snippets of the people speaking, then you are, as he says, venturing into a different world, the multimedia world. And we find that the impact of that and the follow-up of audiences on that is far higher. I mean, people do. They're actually getting the full multimedia experience of that, and they do take it seriously. My own sense is that the form ought to be determined by the content. You know, you don't create a format for 10,000 words and then everybody has to try and fill that space. It's crazy. There is a particular kind of fascination just now in India for long form. It's given rise to an incredible amount of very bad writing.
Here too.
You know, I, as a journalism teacher, I generally, a thing I tell my students every year, you really want to keep a secret, put it in 4,000 words. You know, your secret is safe. Yeah, you want to be read, then think about 1,000 or less. And think that, you know, you're going to be doing other stuff on the same subject. It adds up. That's how you get published books sometimes, right? As collations. Yeah.
I'm sorry, just one quick footnote to that, because thinking about the many possible uses of short form for any kind of analysis, the fascinating thing is, I mean, I've spent all this time helping people get stuff out of long interviews so that they could then code it and assemble them. If you start with a very small bit, I mean, we have this proposal in, if somebody wants to run with it, to gather probably easily could be 1 million stories of girls interviewing their mothers, their grandmothers, about what difference it makes that women have had the right to vote over their lives. 1,000,000 stories you could get using a mode like this. Well, if each one is 45 seconds long, you could then code those like that. They're ready to go. You just set up an Excel spreadsheet and click off the things, and then you could do subsorts by region, by race, by theme, by combinations of things. I want, Hispanic girls talking about, political participation in the context of immigration. And you'd get those stories where their grandmothers have, So I think the idea that it's, in a funny way, it breaks down the distinction between qualitative and quantitative research, because you're dealing with small modular units that could easily be assembled, then they could be crunched. X% of this group, given this prompt, had this kind of story, and 14% had that. So I think it opens up a whole lot of possibilities that make it an interesting realm to explore.
Let's collect a few comments. Christine?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, but I think there are two very different issues in what you've raised. One is on the question of indigenous knowledge. There is also there are also many understandings within indigenous people. We have more than 450 groups, and each of them has their idea of what is sacred or what is, and we would never intrude on that. Okay, it goes without saying. Like, in the sense that we would give it the same, we would be as sensitive to non-indigenous people about something they don't want to have appear in print or in text or on site, but an overall experience that they do want to share. Yeah, there has to be consent and much more. There has to be collaboration. There has to be creation. So the point is this, that if an indigenous person or even a non-indigenous person says, this is somehow sacred to us, it's important to us, this part we cannot venture into, we won't. We are still very young, 36 months. We haven't run, also most of us are journalists of 20, 30 years experience, though the volunteers are entirely very young journalists. And so I've dealt with indigenous people for 38 years. So there is some sense of respect and how not to mess up. That does happen. The other part of your question was about creating pressure by. I don't see that practicing representation creates pressure. It creates pressure on the elites. It creates elites. There's a saying in India: when the poor become literate, the rich lose their palanquin bearers. Yeah. So when we decide that what we are doing by saying people should come from these different sections, we are democratizing the media. We are not putting pressure on anybody. We are trying to keep people who have been traditionally excluded from the media, getting them storming in. And we are finding that some of those people whom we have brought in are now being sought after by corporate media, which now finds, oh yeah, there's some talent there. Of course, there was a hell of a lot of work put in by us also for that, right? But it's that a profit-making media doesn't see value in spending that much time, money in getting that journalism out of them. So in fact, the more representative it is, I think the less pressure there is on that community or society.
Louisa wanted to jump in here. Louisa is asking for examples of successful community advocacy work arising from these efforts.
I could, and I will, but I have to tell you this, that we see ourselves as journalists running a journalistic platform. Okay, we are not an NGO. We are not a non-governmental. And frankly, I won't digress too much, but I have problems with the NGOization of just about everything. Yeah, I mean, what is an NGO? A football club is an NGO. You know, I actually believe this word NGO came, I think we invented it, okay, in India. It came to cover up the loss of something much more noble, which was voluntary. Now, if you're being paid $180,000 a year for being a volunteer, you know, it's difficult to call yourself a voluntary organization, right? So, I think that we are not, but I was digressing. I'm saying we are not a service delivery NGO, but yes, we find a hell of a lot of impact. Like, for instance, working with women in Kerala on the media training part. Incidentally, the cameras, whatever we use to train them, they become the property of those poor women. And they have formed a little group that's earning an income from shooting village weddings at half of what it would cost that family if they hired a photographer from a big city. Yeah, so I mean, that's one. In terms of they're actually making, they've developed a skill and they're earning an income from it, and they love doing it. That's one. The second is a heck of a lot of our stories and have led to governmental intervention, state intervention, schools and colleges adopting practices, things like that. Oh yeah, very, very, very much. One of the big struggles of poor women in the Himalayas, in the Himalayan region called Pittorgarh, for 40 years they've been fighting for a post office in their village. It's incredibly important to them. You may not think so in the internet age, but then there is no network in the mountains. Okay, that's one. Second, it's a postal order economy. All the men have migrated. They work in the armed forces. They work as security guards in the cities. Now, unless you have a bloody post office, how do you get your money? You need your money order. You need your postal money order. And if your post office is 60 miles away in the hills, that's a walk, right? And for some people, 6 hours and 8 hours away. So when we did this story, they got their post office in 48 hours. Yeah, I mean, that's just one. I mean, I
So
could.
through the effective shaming?
No, it so happened that Parliament was in session, and the telecom minister saw the story, and he just had them open some building there. It's functioning now. Okay, then we've done things in the educational sector which have had that kind of impact that you're looking for, a large number of examples. And okay, let me give you the kind of example I like. Anti-displacement battles, people being thrown off their land for mining. Okay, there was a, tomorrow I'll show you that clip. There's in every Indian district, region, you'll find scores and scores of local bards, you know, poets, writers. This guy is a Dalit. He probably can't write, but he composes. Okay, so he did an extempore song on asking the big company to go back to South Korea. POSCO is one of the great steel companies. And we shot that on a cell phone. And then we sent it back to him on a DVD with a friend who had a DVD player. And to their main agitation protest in 2015. That song has become the anthem of the countryside in the anti-mining battles. So I mean, our impact is of a different kind, but it's there. And incidentally, the mining company has withdrawn.
Wow. Do we have other questions? Ulo.
Sorry?
I'll rephrase.
Of course.
Can I just quickly paraphrase since we're recording?
Yeah.
So Ulo has asked, first of all, that, not all folklore is pretty. What do you do about expressions that are violent or aggressive or could put their expressors into jeopardy? And then his second question is, as this gets more and more popular, how do you save it from being instrumentalized or appropriated by a political party?
I think that's a very, very difficult and delicate issue to tackle. Okay? More so, like say, if you look at present day India or many other countries where you have the other side of the use of folklore, where say religious fundamentalists then present folklore as the revealed word, right? We're seeing that in the country right now. Yeah. So we have ministers who want to put into textbooks to teach children that India had the internet 9,000 years ago. That we had flying chariots and advanced aircraft systems 40,000 years ago. Okay, now you see where it's gone. Okay, and that is an extremely difficult. We just have to play it story by story and see what happens. However, our platform is mainly into journalism. We keep folklore in a separate section. Incidentally, I don't know, Dorothy, if you received it. We've just done a story on a storyteller and he moves so beautifully between history, folklore, and many other areas that it really makes you think it's important to know how to contextualize this. That's a constant challenge. But yes, we do sometimes not carry something. We're not there to hurt somebody's sentiments. We're not there to, like for instance, India, a lot of people do not know, has had historically a significant transgender community. Okay? Now they had certain, we cover them, probably the only ones before the law changed and gave them an identity officially. But we won't cover them without consultation. There are certain things they don't want covered. We would respect that. They're not indigenous people, but we would still respect that. Okay? And there are certain things of lore over there which they do not want to talk about. You do not intrude there. I mean, that's how we go about it. But we feel that with each such experience, we learn something. But we need to be extremely sensitive to this. We are more scared, though. We are quite confident of being able to do that. We are much more scared of the other side of it, which I told you about. So suppose the same things about the 9,000-year internet, etc., we cover as rationalists, as journalists. That is far more likely to attract trouble. And that trouble I've known for 38 years. So I'll live with it.
All right. Mike, do you want to add anything here? Further? I thought we might also talk about the business model, because this is an extraordinary work being done on the basis of volunteers and donations. I thought we might talk both about the PARI, anti-business model, and then Mike, of course, is doing a different kind of practice that I think is also of interest to many of us in setting up a kind of consulting firm that's then available. I take it you have to go to different kinds of clients in order to support the kind of work that you really want to do. So I thought perhaps both might say a little bit about how they can make this happen in terms of the labor involved.
Well, I get yes. So we work on a client basis, and so in some ways it's very relaxing. I mean, we'll work on whatever comes in the door. We need to charge fees, but they're very scalable. We do a lot of low-end work with community organizations or pro bono work in many cases to get things going. But ultimately, we take our lead from what the clients and the organizations behind them are interested in doing. We have some private clients. We have a number of university clients, like an alumni association doing an oral history collection. But the ones that I think are closest to my interests and what we'd like to do are with community organizations that have the stories and want to in some way leverage them in ways that can advance what they're doing with their community and then project outward from there. I guess coming from the academic side and moving into this, there are a lot of advantages, I think, in working in this mode, and we've learned a great deal. I've probably written more in the last 10 years that I've been doing this work than I would have if I was just following my research projects. And I guess the observation I would have for those of us, those of you and those of all of us still connected to universities, is how incomprehensible this is to most of my colleagues. It's like they have these two categories. You know, one is business and profit making. I mean, we're just trying to pay the bills. You know, we're not really in a high profit zone at all, or any profit for that matter. Versus, quote, their image of scholarship, which is seen as disinterested. And it takes all sorts of forms. People in very privileged positions are very insistent on getting everything for free because they're getting $100,000 in salary and they're provided with lots of free software by their university that has IT departments that are doing things. So they don't quite know what to do with people who are not in that position. But even more than that, there's been almost no recognition that this work has intellectual, that there's a craft involved that's not just a narrow technical thing. And so it's just been a puzzlement to me. I feel we've been very active, learning all kinds of things. I continued teaching my oral history course for quite a while. But by and large, lots of people have found it interesting, but not the people in the departments I came out of at the university. The history department, which I spent over 30 years in, has shown, I would say, zero curiosity in anything that we've been doing for the last 15 years. And I have very good friends there, so it's not a personal, it's like it just doesn't, well, you've changed hats and you're off in a business, and therefore we don't have a shared base of experience to talk with you about, which is really profoundly anti-intellectual in a deeper sense. And I think so there's a kind of parochialism, I think, that is one of the burdens, having been an academic for such a long time, that we carry. And it's not simply in relation to social movements where this often comes up the most. Well, we can't be too activist because we're, have to attend to the objective needs of scholarship. But I'm seeing really the same sort of parochialism in relation to this very different thing, where there's no ability to read a different kind of environment. There's this mantra about open, we've had interesting internal discussions. You're all aware of all of the interest in open source software, which is, of course, very important. And yet we've seen over and over again, particularly at the community level, if you know anything about open source, it's great if you have an IT department that can work with the open source and do something with it. Most open source programs are A, not very useful for people who don't have technical background to do it. B, they're not particularly well supported. And we heard a long presentation in Montreal from somebody at Carnegie Mellon who was basically saying, listen, there are commercial products. You get something from Adobe, they're supporting that and they know what they're doing. And I wouldn't turn and the idea that you're investing everything and finding some, quote, free, we've worked with 4 different off-the-shelf open source programs, all of which were built on grants. And when the grant was over and the grant maker was on to the next project, they're gone. And there's nobody to call, there's no support desk, there's nobody behind it. So I think there's and again, this is often very privileged people who are saying, well, if it's not coming for free, why should we spend anything on it? Well, somebody's putting a great deal of intellectual work into what we think we price things pretty fairly, if not unfairly to ourselves. But the number of people who just, why isn't it free? And yet they're at this position of an institutionally supported,
salary-supported, high level of privilege, expecting everything to be presented to them. So I think there's, I mean, it's something I certainly struggled a lot in my career as a kind of activist within American studies with a kind of parochialism of defensive university level thinking, which has a great deal of trouble moving outside of the box, whatever that box happens to be.
I am
End of
actually
rant.
wondering, I mean, just to follow up, Mike, that's quite interesting about the difficulty that we all have in valuing our services, and I think it's because a lot of us were trained in an academic paradigm where, you know, in the happy position of having a tenured position, your time is sort of your own to dispose of, and anything you do, you, in a sense, volunteer in the sense that you choose that engagement, but you have this steady income and health insurance that makes it possible. And I wonder, you know, you, of course, being an emeritus professor, you know, have perhaps that foundation that allows you to do pro bono work, and I wonder how many years it might be before a young person seeking a career could set up an agency of this kind and expect it to be viable. Are you able to hire people? I mean, is your agency able, do you foresee that
Well, it's a
it would be able to support itself in terms of supporting the labor of the people doing it?
Well, we're approaching that. I mean, the Picstree operation is the one, the consulting operation is never going to be more than break even. So if we get more contracts, I have to hire more people. And so, but we're approaching break evenness on much of that. And yeah, I've been able to do this because I have a base, but I mean, I watch my retirement nest egg disappearing, you know, melting down like a snowball in a microwave with stunning rapidity. And so we're keeping, but we, you know, been able to, we have 3 to 4 employees most of the time, and Picstree has 2 or 3 employees. So, but it's, you know, in a way, I mean, having to make payroll every month, which is what I'm approaching the end of the month. I always start to get more nervous. We do a monthly payroll, so I have to really shuffle around a lot and really pay attention to the receivables and what's coming in when, and start sending out embarrassing to me, letters to people about paying their bills around this time of the month. So it's a salutary, having been in that privileged position that you talked about for a long time, I found it's really actually kind of healthy. And certainly there are many public sector folklorists, one of them sitting right in front of me, and others who, you know, scramble a lot and have been able to patch things together, but it's certainly not easy. And I think for any of us who have, who don't have, you know, an ongoing full-time position, it's a challenge.
And Sainath, you have this incredible complex of volunteered labor and then donors supplying certain kinds of resources, I think.
Well, I mean, a revenue model or a business model, I wish we had one. We don't actually, and I think a lot of my prejudices and thinking on this, and they are prejudices, come out of having worked 38 years in corporate media. Okay? So you just don't want to go the way you were forced to while working for them. And I think different models might work in different societies and diverse conditions differently. Our own understanding was to stay away from direct funding by governments and by corporations. Particularly the latter, if you were as me, like I was. I didn't work for government ever, but I worked in corporate media. So that was one part of it. Second, somewhere there is a deep resistance and prejudice within me in placing the idea of a business model or a revenue model before the idea of content and journalism. Okay? Now, or anything creative. Now, if Shakespeare was required to clear his revenue model with a venture capitalist, would Romeo and Juliet have been a tragedy? Oh, please, Disney actually shot a version of The Hunchback of Notre Dame that has a happy ending.
And The Little Mermaid.
Yeah, and The Little Mermaid. Okay, so it has a happy ending. The Hunchback of Notre Dame has a happy ending because a tragedy is a bad revenue model. You know, so if I get I'm very reluctant to think about that first. Yeah. Having said that, it's a constant struggle, and it is absolutely a constant struggle. How to do it? Yeah, we have a very large number of volunteers, and they are extremely young, and that's probably our great asset. We get 4 kinds of contributions, or 4 or 5 kinds of contributions. The biggest source of our biggest asset is free labor. And here, Mike, actually, everything we've done on open source software because of the very, very large number of young Indian techies who are attracted to our platform, who work by day in Silicon Valley, some of them, for the most proprietary software organizations in the universe, and by night do pari work on open source software. Yeah. So for them, they feel it's like sort of doing one of them told me it's like doing a penance. So
we had 12
so
computer science interns in our Picstree project this summer who wanted to work on a startup and had some of those things. They were all from India, and many of them had exactly the experience he's describing of having, had very, well-supported jobs for some large operation, and then develop their own projects or work with nonprofits or work with startups in a variety of ways.
our calculation is that techies between the age group 23 and 28 put in on the young guys whose billing hours we can count because we didn't pay, but we know what their billing hours are. We calculate that over a 3.5 year period, they gave us close to, while working elsewhere, a little over 20 million rupees worth of free labor. Yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot of money. 2 crores, as we call it. So the second thing is that the trustees, the core group, are all people who have some shared values, and all of us have worked, had careers, etc., etc. I don't know if I can say that myself, but my colleagues have, and our money goes into it. That's the second. The third is public donations. Fourth is people also contribute. Incidentally, we are not allowed to take foreign funds because we lack what the government demands and which they will never give us, which is called a Foreign Contributions Regulatory Authority Act certificate. They have cancelled that certificate for 30,000 NGOs who don't subscribe to their ideological fundamentalist viewpoint, and in our case, they won't even think of giving it to us. So, but people here and elsewhere contribute in terms of equipment. Okay, so somebody coming in who's, say, working in Oracle or something, just buys a video camera off the shelf and gives it to us, which goes into our work. Or for the women whom we trained in the forest dwellers, people gave them 8 little cameras. Okay, very, very nice ones, point and shoots, but with a substantial video capacity. So that's another way. And then small foundations. We are very careful and discriminating. We don't want to get caught into situations where, say, Mr. Ambani's foundation becomes our funder, then we've lost our credibility. We get a lot of credibility from keeping ourselves independent in the ways we do. So yeah, so that's how it goes. And we do participate. We are just about to make our first crowdfunding venture. I mean, saying that there are the corporate thing, there are individuals maybe someone who went to school or college with me, who's the CEO of some middling company now, who will make a donation. Maybe he doesn't know about it yet, but he will. And that sort of a thing, yes. I mean, so this is how we've been functioning. We have not even thought of building a corpus, because then we would trap the money we need for operational expenses. So we're talking about, say, to be able to sustain what we have now, we'd have to be able to raise $100,000 a year. And the rate at which we are expanding, that's going to, the ask is going to be a lot bigger. So far, we swim.
So far we swim. Sounds like both an optimistic and a realistic idea upon which to conclude. We have perhaps a couple more minutes if anybody wants a final word. But we want to thank you all for coming and thank our distinguished visitors for giving us a lot of food for thought. And please come then to Mike Frisch speaking tomorrow at...
Yeah, the round table on public history and public folklore at 10 in the morning, I believe.
At 10 in the morning. Then for those of you who are interested in the question of local journalism and especially rural journalism, please come to a lunchtime meeting tomorrow at 12:30. We're meeting a little bit earlier than the official lunchtime, and then Sainath will be speaking, giving his full lecture tomorrow evening at 6 p.m. So thank you all very much for coming, and please thank our speakers.
Anybody want any of this information on Picstree? It's up here. Please come get it. We're looking for people.